Morale, a story of the war of 1941 to 1943 by Murray Leinster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Morale, a story of the war of 1941 to 1943 by Murray Leinster. Part 1. The profound influence of civil morale upon the course of modern war is nowhere more clearly shown than in the case of that monstrous war engine popularly known as Wobbly. It landed in New Jersey August 16, 1942, and threw the whole eastern coast into a frenzy. In 6 hours, the population of 3 states was in a panic. Industry was paralyzed. The military effect was comparable only to a huge modern army landed in our rear. Strategic Lessons of the War of 1941 to 1943. U.S. War College, pages 79 and 78. Sergeant Walpole made his daily report at 2:15. He used a dinky phone that should have been in a museum, and a rural central put him in the area officer's tight beam. The officer listened drearily as the sergeant said in a military manner, "Sergeant Walpole, sir. Post 14 reports that he has nothing of importance to report." The area's officer's acknowledgment was curt, embittered, for he was an energetic young man and he loathed his job. He wanted to be in the West where the fighting of a highly unconventional nature was taking place daily. He did not enjoy this business of watching an unthreatened coastline simply for the maintenance of civil confidence and morale. He preferred fighting. Sergeant Walpole, though, exhaled a lungful of smoke at the telephone transmitter and waited. Presently, the rural central said, "All through?" "Sure, sweetie," said Sergeant Walpole. "How about the walkies tonight?" That was at 2:20 p.m. There was a coy conversation while the civilian telephone service suffered. Then Sergeant Walpole went back to his post of duty with a date for the evening. He never kept that date, as it turned out. The rural central was dead an hour after the first and only Wobbly landed, and as everybody knows, that happened at 2:45. But Sergeant Walpole had no premonitions as he went back to his hammock on the porch. This was post number 14, 6th Area, Eastern Coast Observation Force. There was a war on, to be sure. There had been war on since the fall of 1941, but it was 2,000 miles away. Even lone wolf bombing planes flying at 40,000 feet up never came this far to drop their eggs upon inviting targets or upon those utterly blank, innocent-seeming places where munitions of war were now manufactured underground. Here was peace and quiet and good rations and a paradise for gold brickers. Here was a summer bungalow taken over for military purposes, quartering 6 men who watched a certain section of coastline for a quite impossible enemy. 3 miles to the south there was another post. 3 miles to the north there was another one still. They stretched all along the Atlantic coast, those observation posts, and the men in them watched the sea, languidly observed the television broadcasts, and slept in the sun. That was all they were supposed to do. In doing it, they helped maintain civilian morale, and therefore the Eastern Coast Observation Force was enviously said to be just attached to the Army for rations by the other services and its members rated with MPs and other low forms of animal life. Sergeant Walpole reclined in his hammock, inhaling comfortably. The ocean glittered blue before him in the sun. There was a plume of smoke out at sea indicating an old-style coal burner, its hull down below the horizon. Anything that would float was being used since the war began, although a coal-burning ship was almost a museum piece. A trim diesel tramp was lazing northward well inshore. A pack of gulls were squabbling noisily over some unpleasantness floating 100 yards from the beach. The diesel tramp edged closer inshore still. It was all very peaceful and placid. There were few softer jobs on earth than being a member of a force in being for the sake of civilian morale. But at 2:32 p.m., the softness of that job departed, as far as Sergeant Walpole was concerned. At that moment, he heard a thin wailing sound high aloft. It was well known enough nearer the front, but the Eastern Coast Observation Force had no need to become unduly familiar with it. With incredible swiftness, the wailing rose to the shrillest of shrieks, descending as lightning might be imagined to descend. Then there was a splattering concussion. It was monstrous. It was ear-splitting. Windows crashed in the cottage and tinkled to the sandy earth outside. There was a pause of seconds' duration only, during which Sergeant Walpole stared blankly and gasped, "What the hell?" Then there was a second thin wailing which rose to a scream. Sergeant Walpole was in motion before the second explosion came. He was diving off to the veranda of post number 14. He saw someone else coming through a window. He had a photographic glimpse of one of his men emerging through a doorway. Then he struck earth and began to run. Like everybody else in America, he knew what the explosions and the screamings meant. But he had covered no more than 50 yards when the third bomb fell from that plane so far aloft that it was not even a mote in the sky. Up there, the sky was not even blue, but a dull leaden gray because of the thinness of the atmosphere yet above it. The men in that high-flight bomber could see the ground only as a mass of vaguely blended colors. They were aiming their bombs by filtered light, through telescopes which used infrared rays only, as aerial cameras did back in the 1920s. And they were sighting their eggs with beautifully exact knowledge of their velocity and height. By the time the bombs had dropped 8 miles, they were traveling faster than the sound of their coming. The first two had wiped out posts 13 and 15. The third made no sound before it landed, except to an observer at a distance. Sergeant Walpole heard neither the scream of the fall nor the sound of its explosion. He was running madly, and suddenly the earth bucked violently beneath his feet. He had a momentary sensation of things flying madly by over his head, and then he knew nothing at all for a very long time. Then his head ached horribly, and someone was popping at something valorously with a rifle, and he heard the nasty sharp explosion of the hydrogenate bullets which have remodeled older ideas of warfare. And Sergeant Walpole was aware of an urgent necessity to do something, but he could not at all imagine what it was. Then a shell went off, the earth's concussion banged his nose against the sand, and the rifle fire stopped. "For God's sake," said Sergeant Walpole dizzily. He staggered to his feet and looked behind him. Where the cottage had been was a hole, quite a large hole. It was probably 100 yards across and all of 20 deep, but seawater was seeping in to fill it through the sand. Its edge was 40 or 50 feet from where he stood. He had been knocked down by the heaving earth, and the sand and the mud blown out of the crater had gone clean over him. 20 feet back, the top part of his body would have been cut neatly off by the blast. As it was, he found his nose bleeding and plugged it with his handkerchief. He was still rather dazed, and he still had the feeling there was something extremely important that he must do. He stood rocking on his feet, trying to clear his head, when 2 men came along the sand dunes behind the beach. One of them carried 2 automatic rifles. The other was trying to bandage a limp and flapping arm as he ran. They saw the sergeant and ran to him. "Hell, Sarge, I thought you all were blown to little eggshells." "I ain't," said Sergeant Walpole. He looked again at the hole in the ground and swore paintedly. "Look at that," said the man with the flapping arm. "Hell's going to pop around here, Sarge." Sergeant swung around, then his mouth dropped open. Just a half a mile away and hardly more than 200 yards from the shoreline, the diesel tramp was ramming the beach. A wake still foamed behind it. A monstrous bow wave spread out on either hand, overtopping even the combers that came rolling in. It was being deliberately run ashore. It struck, and its foremast crumbled up and fell forward, carrying its derrick booms with it. There was a squeal of crumpled metal plates. "Flying a yeller flag just now," painted one of the two privates. "We started popping hydrogenite bullets at her, and she flung a shell at us. She's an enemy ship. But what the hell?" Smoke spurted up from the beached ship. Her stern broke off and settled in deeper water out from the shore. More smoke spurted out. Her bows split wide. There were deep rumbles of black powder explosions. Sergeant Walpole and his two followers stared blankly. More explosions, and the ship was hidden in smoke. When it blew away, her funnel was down, and half more of her upper decks was sliding into the sea. She had listed suddenly. Sergeant Walpole gazed upward. Futilely, of course. There was nothing in sight overhead, but these explosions did look like the hydrogenite stuff they put in small arm bullets nowadays. A .30 caliber bullet had the explosive effect of an old-style 6-pound TNT shell, only hydrogenate goes off with a crack instead of a boom. It was an American plane opening up with a machine gun. Then the beached ship seemed to blow up. A mass of thick smoke covered her from stem to stern, and bits of plating flew heavily through the air, and there were a few lurid bursts of flame. Sergeant Walpole suddenly remembered that there ought to be survivors, only he hadn't seen anybody diving overboard to get ashore. He half started forward. Then the sea breeze blew this smoke, too, away from the wreckage, and the tramp was gone. But there was something else in its place, so that Sergeant Walpole took one look and swallowed a non-existent something that came up instantly into his throat again, and remembered the urgent thing he had to do. "Pete," he said calmly, "you hunt up the area officer and tell him what you've seen. Here, I'll give you a report that'll keep him from slamming you in the clink for being drunk. Grab a monocycle somewheres. It's faster than a car, the way you'll be traveling. First telephone you come to that's working, make Central put you on the tight beam to headquarters. Then go on and report yourself, see?" Pete started and automatically fumbled with his limp and useless arm. Then he carefully tucked the unmanageable hand in the pocket of his uniform blouse. "That doesn't matter now," he said absurdly. He was looking at the thing left in place of the tramp, as Sergeant Walpole scribbled on one of the regulation report forms of the Eastern Coast Observation Force, and the thing he saw was enough to upset anybody. Where the tramp had been, there was a single bit of bow plating sticking up out of the surf, and a bunch of miscellaneous floating wreckage drifting sluggishly towards the beach. And there was quite a solid, rounded, metallic shape, apparently quite as long as the original tramp had been. There was a huge armored tube across its upper section, with a vision slits in two bulbous sections at its end. There were gun ports visible here and there, and already a monstrous protuberance was coming into view midway along its back, as if forced into position from within. Where the bow of the tramp had been, there was a colossal treads now visible. There was a sort of conning tower, armored and grim. There was a ghastly steel beak. The thing was a war machine of monstrous size. It emitted a sudden roaring sound as of internal combustion engines operating at full power, and lurched heavily. The steel plates of the tramp were still visible above water, crumpled up like paper, and were trodden under. The thing came toward the shore. It slithered through the shallow sea with waves breaking against its bulging sides. It came out upon the beach, its wet sides glittering. It was 200 feet long. It looked somehow like a giant centipede. It was a tank of sorts, but like no tank ever seen on Earth before. It was the great-grandfather of all tanks. It was so monstrous that for its conveyance, a ship's hull and superstructure had been built about it, and its own engines had been the engines of that ship. It was so huge that it could only be landed by blasting away a beach ship from about itself, so it could run under its own power over the fragments to the shore. Now it stopped smoothly on the sandy beach, in which its 8-foot wide steel tread sank almost a yard. Men dropped down from the ports in its swelling sides. They made swift, careful inspections of predetermined points. They darted back up the ladders again. The thing roared once more. Then it swung about, headed for the sand dunes, and with extraordinary smoothness and celerity disappeared inland. Part 2. The Wobbly was meant for one purpose, the undermining of civilian morale. To accomplish that purpose, it set systematically about the establishment of a reign of terror. And so complete was its success that half the population of a state was in a headlong flight within 2 hours. It was, first, mysterious, second, deadly, and within a very few hours it had built up a reputation for invincibility, judged on the basis of its first 12 hours' work alone. It was the most successful experiment of the war. Its effect on civilian morale was incalculable. Strategic Lessons of the War, 1941 to 1943. U.S. War College, pages 80 and 81. Two of the members of the Observation Post 14 gaped at the retreating monster. Sergeant Walpole scribbled on the official form. Just as the monstrous thing dipped down out of sight, there was a vicious, crashing report from its hinder part. Something shrieked. Sergeant Walpole got up, spitting sand. There was blood on the report form in his hand. He folded it painstakingly. Of the two men who had been with him, one was struggling out of the sand as Sergeant Walpole had to do. The other was scattered over a good many yards of sandy beach. They seen us, said Sergeant Walpole, and they got Pete. You'll have to take this report. I'm going after the damn thing. What for? Asked the other man blankly. To keep it in sight, said Sergeant Walpole. That's tactics. If somebody springs something you ain't able to fight, run away, but keep it in sight and report to the nearest commissioned officer. Remember that. Now get on. There's motorcycles in the village. Get there and beat that damn wobbly thing with the news. He saw his followers start off sprinting. That particular soldier, by the way, was identified by his dog tags some days later. As nearly as could be discovered, he had died of gas. But Sergeant Walpole picked up one of the two rifles, blew sand out of the breech mechanisms, and started off after the metal monster. He walked in the 8-foot track of one of its treads. As he went, he continued cleaning sand from the rifle in his hands. The rifle was useless against such a monster, of course, but it is quaint to reflect that such an automatic rifle firing hydronite bullets, each equivalent to a 6-pounder TNT shell in destructiveness, Sergeant Walpole carried greater firepower than Napoleon ever disposed in battle. The tread of the Wobbly made a perfect roadway. Presently, Sergeant Walpole looked up to find himself scrutinizing somebody's dining room table set for lunch. The Wobbly had crossed the house in its path without swerving. Walls, chimneys, timbers, and planks all gone beneath its treads. But they had been pressed so smoothly flat that until Sergeant Walpole looked down at his footings, he would not have known he was walking on the wreckage of a building. It was half an hour before he reached the village. The wobbly had gone from end to end, backing up and gone over the rest of it again. There was the taint of gas in the air. Sergeant Walpole halted outside the debris. His gas mask had been blown to atoms with the observation post 14. "They're trying to beat the news of their coming," he reflected aloud, "which is why they smashed up the village. The telephone exchange was there. Tilly's under there somewheres." He fumbled with the rifle, suddenly swearing queerly hate-disoriented oaths. Tilly had not been the great love of Sergeant Walpole's life. She was merely a country telephone operator, reasonably pretty and flattered by his uniform. But she was under a mass of splintered wood and crushed brickwork, killed while trying to connect with tight beam to the area headquarters to report the monster rushing upon the village. That monster had destroyed the little settlement. There was nothing left at all but wreckage and the 8-foot tracks of monster treads. Sometimes those tracks crossed each other. Between them, wreckage survived to a height of as much as 4 feet, which was the clearance of Wobbly's body. Something roared low overhead. Sergeant Walpole swore bitterly, looked upward, and waited to die. But the small plane was American and old. It was a training plane, useless for front-line work. It dived to the earth, the pilot waved impatiently, and Walpole plunged to a place beside him. Instantly thereafter, the plane took off. "What was it?" shouted the pilot, sliding off at panic-stricken speeds across the treetops. "They heard bombs go off all the way to Philly. Sent me. What in the hell was it?" A thin, high wailing sound coming down as lightning might have imagined to descend. The pilot dived madly and got behind a pine forest before the explosion and the concussion that followed it. Sergeant Walpole saw the pine trees shiver. The sheer explosion wave of that egg, if it hit an old ship like this in midair, would have stripped the fabrics from its wings. "Set me down," said Sergeant Walpole. "They're watching us from aloft. I sent the man on a monocycle to report." But he told luridly of the thing that had come to shore and of its destructiveness. "Now set me down, give me a gas mask, and clear out. You ain't got a burglar's chance of getting back." The pilot set him down and began ticking away on a code sender even as he landed. Then he climbed swiftly away from the sergeant, headed in a weaving, crazy line to westward. Then things screamed downward, and Sergeant clapped his hands over his ears once more. The ground quivered underfoot, though eggs landed a good 3/4 of a mile away. The training plane dropped like a plummet. The sharpness of a hydronite explosion carries its effect to quite incredible distances. The fabrics of its wings split to ribbons. The ship landed somewhere, and smoke rose from it. "You shouldn't have gone so high," said the Sergeant Walpole. He struck across country for the treads of the Wobbly once more. He saw a schoolhouse. The Wobbly had passed within 100 yards of it. The schoolhouse seemed deserted. Then the sergeant saw the hole in its roof. Then he caught the infinitely faint taint of gas. "Mighty anxious," said Sergeant Walpole woodenly, "not to let news get ahead of 'em. Yeah, if it busts on places without warning, it'll have that much easier work. I hope I'm on the party when we get this damn thing." There was no use in approaching the schoolhouse, though he had a gas mask on now. Sergeant Walpole went on. Part 3. The Wobbly made no attempt to do purely military damage. The enemy command realized that the destruction of civilian morale was even more important than the destruction of munitions factories. In this, the enemy displayed the same acumen that makes the war a fruitful subject of study to the strategic student. Strategic Lessons of the War, 1941 to 1943. U.S. War College, pages 81 through 82. At nightfall, the monster swerved suddenly and moved with greater speed. It showed no lights. It did not even make very much noise. Then the second flight of home defense planes made their attack. Sergeant Walpole heard them droning overhead. He lit a fire instantly. A little helicopter dropped from the blackness above him, and it began to heap dirt desperately on the blaze. "Who's there?" demanded a voice. "Sergeant Walpole, Pulse 14, Eastern Coast Observation," said the sergeant in a military manner. "Beg to report, sir, that the dinkus that brought down the other ships is housed inside that big bulge on top of the wobbly." "Get in," said the voice. The sergeant obeyed. With a purring noise, the helicopter shot upward. Then something went off in mid-skies miles ahead, where the faint humming noise had announced the flight of attack planes. A lurid, crackling detonation lit up the sky, one of the ships of the night-flying squadron. From the helicopter, they could see the rest of the flight lined clearly in the flash of the explosion. Instantly thereafter, there was another such flash, then another. "3," said the voice beside Sergeant Walpole, and another flash. "4." The invisible operator of the screw lift ship was very calm about it. 5. 6. The explosions lit the sky. Presently it said grimly, "That's all of them. I better report it." He was silent for a while. Sergeant Walpole saw his hand flickering a key up and down in the faint light of radio bulbs. "Now shoot the works," said the helicopter man evenly. "All the ships that attacked this afternoon went down." One of them started to report but didn't get 2 words through. "What did that damn thing use on 'em?" "A dinkus on top, sir," said Sergeant Walpole formally. "I'd found a motorcycle, sir, and it was trailing the thing. It come to a top of a hill and seen it moving through a pine wood, crashing down the trees in front of it like they wasn't there. Then an egg came down from God knows where up aloft. I stopped up my ears thinking it was aiming for me. Then I seen the ships. 2 of them were falling. They landed, and I heard a couple of other explosions, little ones, they sounded like." The helicopter's wrist was flicking up and down. "Little ones," he said sarcastically. "Those ships were carrying 500-pound bombs. It was those you heard going off?" "Maybe," conceded Sergeant Walpole. "There were 20 or 30 ships flying in formation, going hell for leather for the wobbly. They were trailing it from the air. They were coming natural for me, because I was between them and it. Then my pants caught on fire." "What?" "My pants caught on fire," said Sergeant Walpole woodenly. "I was sitting on a motorcycle trying to figure out which way to duck, and my pants caught on fire. The bike was getting hot. I climbed off of it and it blew up. My rifle got hot too, and I chucked it away. Then I saw a ship go down on fire. The wobbly stopped still, and it hadn't fired a shot. I'll swear to that. Just my motorcycle got hot and caught on fire. Then a ship busted out in flames and went down. A couple more eggs come down, and 3 ships dropped. Didn't hit them. The concussions blew the fabric off of them. Another one caught fire and crashed. Then another one. I looked and saw the next one catch. Then the next. It was like a searchlight beam hitting them." The pilot's hand flicked up and down interminably. There was a steady, fierce downbeat of the slipstream from the vertical propters. The helicopter swept forward in a swooping dash. "The whole East Coast's gone crazy," said the copter man dryly. "Crazy fools trying to run away. Roads jammed, work stopped. It leaked out about the planes being wiped out today, and everybody in 3 states has heard these eggs going off. You're the only living man who's seen that crawling thing and lived to tell about it. I've sent your stuff back. What's that about the thing on top?" "I hid," said Sergeant Walpole woodenly. "The wobbly sent over gas shells where the ships landed. Then it went on, heading west. It got a crazy-looking dinkus on top like a searchlight. That moved while the ships were catching fire and crashing. Just like a searchlight. It moved and the ship went down, but the wobbly didn't fire a shot." The helicopter's man's wrist flexed swiftly. "God," said Sergeant Walpole in sudden agony. "Drop, quick." The helicopter went down like a stone. A propter shrieked away into space. Metalwork up aloft glowed dully red. Then there were whipping and lashing branches closing swiftly all around the helicopter. A jerk, a crash, stillness, the smell of growing things all about. Well, said the copter pilot. They turned it on us, whatever it is, said Sergeant Walpole. They near got us, too. A match scratched. A cigarette glowed. The sergeant fumbled for a smoke himself. I'm waiting for the metal to cool off, said the helicopter pilot. Maybe we can take off again. They located us with a loop while they got sending your stuff. Damn! I see what they've got. What? A way of transmitting real power in a radio beam, said the copter man. You've seen eddy current stoves. Everybody cooks with them nowadays. A coil with a high-frequency current. You can stick your hand in it, but nothing happens. But if you stick an iron pan down in the coil, and it gets hot and cooks things. Hysteresis. The same thing that used to make transformer cords get hot. The same thing that happens near any beam transmitter. Only you have to measure the heating effect with a thermocouple. The iron absorbs the radio waves and gets hot. The chaps in the wobbly can probably put 10,000 horsepower in a damn beam. We can't. But any iron in the way will get hot. It blows up a ship at once. Your motorcycle and your rifle too. Damn. He knocked ash off his cigarette. Scientific, those chaps. I'll see if that metal's cool. Something whined overhead, rising swiftly to a shriek as it descended. Sergeant Walpole cowered with his hands to his ears. But it was not an earth-shaking concussion. It was an explosion, yes, but subtly different from the rending snap of hydronite. Gas, said the sergeant sullenly and fumbled for his mask. No good, said the copter man briefly. Visicatore, smell it? I guess they've got us. No sag suits, not even sag paste. The sergeant lit a match. The flame bent a little from vertical. There's a wind. We got a chance. Get going, then, said the copter man. Run upwind. Sergeant Walpole slid over the side and ran. 100 yards. 200. Pine woods have little undergrowth. He heard the copter's engine start. The ship tried to lift. He redoubled his speed. Presently, he broke out into open plowed land. In the starlight, he saw a barn, and he raced towards that. Someone else plunged out of the woods towards him. The helicopter engine was still roaring faintly in the distance. Then a thin whine came down from aloft. When the echoes of the explosion died away, the pilot was grinning queerly. The helicopter's engine was still. I said it could be done. Pack of fatheads at headquarters. Huh? Picking up a ship by its spark plugs with a loop. They're doing that up aloft. There's a ship up there, 40,000 feet or so. Maybe half a dozen ships, refueling in air, I guess, and working with the thing you call the wobbly. When I started the copter's engines, they got the spark impulses and sighted on them. We'd better get away from here. Horses in here, said Sergeant Walpole. The wobbly came by. No people left. They brought the animals out. The horses reared and plunged as they were infinitely sharp, deadly explosions of the eggs coming down 8 miles through the darkness. Let's go. After the wobbly, said the copter man. Of course, said Sergeant Walpole. Somebody's got to find out how to lick it. They went clattering through the darkness. It was extraordinary what desolation, what utter lack of human life they moved through. They came to a town, and there was a taint of gas in the air. No lights burned in that town. It was dead. The wobbly had killed it. Part 4. Which panic was enhanced by the destruction of a second flight of fighting planes. However, the destruction of Bensborough completed civilian demoralization. A newscasting company rebroadcast a private television contact with the town at the moment the wobbly entered it. Practically all the inhabitants of the Atlantic coast heard and saw the annihilation of the town, hearing cries of gas and the screams of the people, and hearing the crashings of the wobbly crushed its way inexorably across the city, spreading terror everywhere. Frenzied demands were made upon the government for recall of troops from the front to offer battle to the wobbly. It's considered that at that time, the one wobbly had military effect equal to at least 500,000 men. Strategic Lessons of War of 1941 to 1943. U.S. War College, pages 83 through 84. They did not enter the town. There was just enough starlight to show that the wobbly had gone through it and then crashed back and forth ruthlessly. There was a great gash through the center of buildings nearest the edge, and there were other gashes visible here and there. Everything was crushed down utterly flat in 2 8-foot paths. There was a mass of crumbled debris 4 feet high at its highest in between tread marks. They looked silently and went on. They reached a railroad track, the quadruple track of a branch line from New York to Philadelphia. The wobbly was going along that right-of-way. There was no right-of-way left where it had been. Rails were crushed flat. Culverts were broken through. But the horses raced along the smooth tread trails. Once broken, twisted rail tore at Sergeant Walpole's sleeve. Somehow, the last great plate of a tread had bent it upward. Presently, they saw a mass of something dark off to the left. Flames were licking meditatively at one of the wrecked cars. Then they heard explosions far ahead. Flames lighted the sky. "Our men in action," said Sergeant Walpole hungrily. He flogged his mount mercilessly. Then the sky became bright in the distance. The horses, going down the crushed smooth trail of the treads, gained upon the din. Then they saw the cause of it, miles distant. A train was burning luridly. Its forepart was wreckage, pure and simple. The rest was going up in flames and detonations. Munitions, of course. The wobbly was off at one side, flame-lit and monstrous, sliding smoothly out of sight. 10 miles of railroad, said the copter pilot calmly, smashed out of existence. That's going to scare our people to fits. They can drop eggs till the cows come home, and every egg will smash up 100 yards of right-of-way, and we can build it back up again in 4 hours with a mobile track layer. But 10 miles to be regraded and laid is different. Half of America will be imagining all our railroads smashed and starvation ahead. A piercing light fell upon him. "Shut it off," roared Sergeant Walpole. "Do you want to get us killed?" He and the copter pilot swerved. There was a car there, a huge 2-wheeled car whose gyroscopes hummed softly while the driver tried to extract it from something it was tangled in. "I commandeer this car," said the copter pilot. "Military necessity. We have to trail that wobbly." Someone grunted. Lights flashed on within. The copter pilot and Sergeant Walpole stiffened to attention. The stars of a major general shone upon the collar of the stout man within. "Beg pardon, sir," said the pilot, and was still. Said the major general. "There seems to be just 4 of us alive who've seen the thing clearly. I hit upon it by accident, I'll admit. What do you know about it?" "It comes from a tramp steamer," began Sergeant Walpole. You're Sergeant Walpole. Mention the dispatches tomorrow, Sergeant. You, sir?" "It's weapons against our planes, sir," said the copter man precisely. "Is a radio beam carrying several thousand horsepower of energy. When it hits iron, sir, the energy is absorbed and the iron heats up and blows up the ship. The wobbly's working with a bomber well aloft, sir, which spots planes from below by picking up their spark plug flashes in a directional loop. The bomber aloft, sir, drops eggs when the wobbly's attacked. Sergeant Walpole reports several planes disabled by their fabric being blown off their wings." "I know," said the Major General. "Damn it, the front takes every ship that'll fit to go aloft. We have only wrecks back here. You sure about that spark plug affair?" "Yes, sir," said the copter pilot. "My ship crashed, sir. I started the motors again, trying to take off. Eggs began to drop about me instantly." "Nasty," said the Major General. "I was going to join my men. We flung a line of artillery ahead of the thing. Motor-driven, of course. But they can pick up motors by the spark waves. The bomber knows all about it. Nasty." He lit a cigar calmly. The gyro car shifted suddenly and backed away from the thing it had been tangled in. "Why ain't the bombers been shot down?" demanded Sergeant Walpole angrily. "Damn it, sir, if it wasn't for the bombers—" "Up to an hour ago," said the Major General, "we had lost 68 planes trying to get those bombers. You see, it works both ways. The bombers drop eggs to help the Wobbly defend itself, and the Wobbly uses that power beam you spoke of to wipe the sky clean about the bombers. I wonder how it was done. Before you explain, sir, do you men want to come with me? Get on the running board if you like. We shall probably be killed. The gyro car purred softly away with 2 horses left wandering, and the 2 men clinging fast in a sweep of wind. They found a ribbon of concrete road, and the wind sang as the car picked up speed. Then suddenly it bucked madly and went out of control, and as suddenly was passing along the road again. The Wobbly had passed over the roadway here. Then they heard gunfire ahead. Honest, malevolent gunfire. Flashes lit the horizon. The gyrocar sped up until it fairly hummed, and the wind rushed into the nostrils and the mouth of the men on the running boards. The cannonade increased. It reached really respectable proportions until it became a titanic din. As the road rose up along the incline, a shell burst in midair in plain view, and the driver of the gyrocar jammed on the brakes and looked down upon the strangest sights below. There were other hills yet ahead, and from behind them came that faint, indefinite glow, which is the glow of the lights of a city. At the bottom of the valley, a mile and a half distant, there was the Wobbly. Star shells flared near it, casting it into intolerable brightness and clear relief, and other shells were breaking upon it and all about it. From beyond the rim of the hills came flashes of guns. The air was full of screaming and many crashes. The Wobbly was motionless. It looked more than ever like a monstrous, deadly centipede. It was under a rain of fire that would have shattered a dreadnought of the 1920s. Its monstrous treads were motionless. It seemed queerly quiescent, abstract. It seemed less defiant of the shell fire that broke upon it like hail of hell than indifferent to it. Yes, it seemed indifferent. Only the queer excrescence on its top moved, and that stirred vaguely. Star shells floated overhead and bathed it in pitiless light, and it remained motionless. Sergeant Walpole had a vague impression of a colossal detonation taking place miles above his head, but the sound was lost in the drum fire of artillery nearer at hand. Then a gun on the Wobbly moved. It spouted a flash of bluish flame, then another and another. It seemed to fire gas shells into the town at this moment, ignoring the batteries playing upon it. It was still again, where the queer excrescence on its back moved vaguely, and its shell burst about it in a very inferno. Then the treads moved, and with a swift celerity, the Wobbly moved smoothly forward and up the incline toward the cannonade guns. It went over the top of the incline, and those in the gyrocar saw its reception. Guns opened upon it at point-blank range. Now the Wobbly itself went into action. In the light of the star shells and explosions, they saw its guns begin to bellow. It went swiftly and malevolently forward, moving with centipede smoothness. It dipped out of sight. The cannonade lessened. 2 guns stopped. 3. Half the guns were out of action. A dozen guns ceased to fire. One last weapon boomed desperately at its maximum rate of fire. That stopped. The night became strangely, terribly still. The Major General put aside his radiovision receiver. Although neither the helicopter pilot nor Sergeant Walpole had noticed it, he had opened communication the instant the gyrocar came to a stop. Now the Major General was desperately, terribly white. The artillery is wiped out, he observed detachedly. The Wobbly, it seems, is going on into the town. They did not want to listen. Those men who waited futilely by the gyrocar, which had witnessed the invulnerability of the Wobbly to all attack. They did not want to listen at all, but they heard the noises as the Wobbly crashed across the town, back and forth. Moral effect, said the Major General, through stiff lips. That's what it's for, to break down the morale behind the lines. Good God! what hellish things mere words can mean. Part 5. The only weak spot in the Wobbly's design, apparently, was the necessity of using its entire engine power in the power beam with which it protected itself and its attendant bombers from aerial attack. For a time, before New Brunswick, it was forced to remain still under fire, while it fought off and destroyed an attacking fleet 8 miles above it. With sufficiently powerful artillery, it might have been destroyed at that moment, but it was invulnerable to the artillery available. Deliberately false statements were broadcast to reassure the public, but the public was already skeptical, as it later became incredulous of official reports of victories. The destruction of New Brunswick became known despite official denials, and the colossal riots broke out among the inhabitants of the larger cities, intent upon escape from defenseless towns. Orders were actually issued withdrawing 250,000 men from the front-line reserve, with artillery in proportion to their forces. Strategic Lessons of War, 1941 to 1943. U.S. War College, page 42. The Major General left them at the town, now quite still and silent. Sergeant Walpole said detachedly, "We'll probably find a portable reader, sir, and trail the Wobbly. That's about all we can do, sir." "It looks," said the Major General rather desperately, "as if that is all anybody can do. I'm going on to take command ahead." The copter pilot said politely, "Sir, if you're going to sow mines for the Wobbly, of course. That power beam can explode them, sir, before the Wobbly gets to them. May I suggest, sir, that the mine cases with no metal in them at all would be worth trying?" "Thank you," said the Major General grimly. "I'll have concrete ones made." Sergeant Walpole grunted suddenly. "Look here, sir. That Wobbly stops when it uses that dinkus on top. This guy here says it uses a lot of power, 4,000 or 5,000 horsepower." "More likely 10 or 20, said the copter pilot. "Maybe," said Sergeant Walpole profoundly. "It takes all the power they got to work that dinkus. They were working it just now when the artillery was slamming them. So next time you want to tackle it, stick a flock of bombs around and attack the bombers too. If they're kept busy down below, maybe the planes can get the bombers, or otherwise they'll get a chance to use a big gun on the Wobbly." The Major General nodded. "We four," he observed, "we are the only living men who've actually seen the Wobbly and gotten away. I shall use both your suggestions, and I shall not send those orders by radio, not even type beam radio. I'll carry them myself. Good luck." A non-commissioned officer of the Eastern Coast Observation Fort and a yet uncommissioned flying cadet waved a cheerful goodbye to the Major General in charge of home defense in 3 states. Then he went on into the town. "Monocycles first," said Sergeant Walpole, "and a sender." The copter man nodded. The streetlights of the town dimmed and brightened. The Wobbly had paused only to create havoc, not to produce utter chaos. It had gone back and forth over the town 2 or 3 times, spewing out gas as it went. But most of the town was still standing, and the powerhouse had not been touched. Only its untended diesels had checked before a fuel pump cleared. They found the cycle shop, its back wall bulged in by wreckage against it. Sergeant Walpole inspected its wares expertly. A voice began to speak suddenly. A television set had somehow been turned on by the crash that bulged the back wall. "The monster tank has been held in check," said a smug voice encouragingly, "encountered by home defense troops and artillery. It proved unable to face shell fire." "Liars," said the copter man calmly. He picked up the nearest loose object and flung it into the bland face of the official news announcer. The television set went dead, but there were hissings and sputtering in its interior. He had flung a Bissell battery at it, one of a display group, and its high-tension terminals had hissed and sparked among the stray wires in the cabinet. That makes me mad, said the copter man grimly. Lying for morale. The other side murders our civilians to break down morale, and our side lies about it to build morale back up again. To hell with morale. Sergeant Walpole reached in and pulled out the battery. Bissell batteries turn out 600 volts these days, and they make a fat spark when short-circuited. For God's sake, said Sergeant Walpole, if they can pick up sparks from a motor, can't they pick them up from this? What the hell you doing? You want 'em dropping eggs on us? Say! He stopped short, his eyes burning. He began to talk, suddenly groping for words while he waved a high-powered small battery in his hand. The helicopter man listened, at first skeptically, and then with equally hungry enthusiasm. Sergeant, he said evenly, that's a great idea, a whale of an idea, a hell of a fine idea. Let's get some rockets. Why rockets? Demanded Sergeant Walpole in his turn. What you gonna do, celebrate the 4th of July? The copter man explained this time, and Sergeant Walpole seized upon the addition. Then they began a hunt. They roved the town over, and it was not pleasant. When the Wobbly had gone into that town, there had been very many living human beings in it. Some of them had believed in the ability of the artillery to defend the town against a single monster. Some had no means of getting away, but all of them had tried to get away when the Wobbly went lurching among the houses. For them, the Wobbly had spewed out deadly gases. It also had simply forged ahead, and the 2 living men in their gas masks paid as little attention as possible to the bodies in the streets. Most of them in flimsy night clothing struck down into a frenzied flight, but they could not help seeing too much. In the end, they went back to the artillery positions and found signal rockets there. 2 full cases of them, marvelously unexploded. A little later, 2 motorcycles purred madly in the beaten-down paths of the monstrous treads. Sergeant Walpole bore very many Bissell batteries, which will deliver 600 volts even on short circuits for half an hour at a time. The copter man carried some of them too, and both men were loaded down. When dawn came, they were hollow-eyed and gaunt and weary. It had started to rain too, and both of them were drenched. They could see no more than a couple of 100 yards in every direction, and they were hungry. They had seen things that no man should have looked upon in the way of destruction. They came upon a wrecked artillery train just as the world lightened to a pallid gray. Guns twisted and burst, caissons no more than shattered scraps of metal because of the explosions of the shells within, and the tread tracks of the Wobbly led across the mess. Steam still rose, hissing softly from the bent and twisted guns which had burst when they were heated to redness by the power beam. And there was a staff gyrocar crumpled against a tree where it had been flung by some explosion or other. There were neither sound nor wounded men about, only dead ones. The Wobbly had been here. "Hello," said the copter man in a dreary levity. "There's a portable vision set in this car. Let's call up the general and see how he is." Sergeant Walpole spat, then held up his hand. He was listening. Far off in the drumming downpour of the rain there was a rumbling sound. He had heard it before. It was partly made up of the noise of internal combustion engines of unthinkable power, and partly of grumbling treads forcing a way through reluctant trees. It was a long way off now, but it was coming nearer. "The Wobbly," said Sergeant Walpole. "Coming back? Why hell's bells? Why is it coming back?" "I don't know," said the copter man, "but let's get some rockets fixed up." The 2 of them worked almost lackadaisically. They were tired out, but they took the tiny Bissell batteries and twisted the attached wires about the rocket heads. They had 20 or 30 of them fixed by the time the noise of the Wobbly was very near. There was the noise of felled trees pushed down by the Wobbly in its progress. Great crackling crashes, then crunching sounds, and above them thunderous smooth purring rumble of the monster. The copter man climbed into the upside-down staff car. He turned the vision set on and fiddled absurdly with the controls. The bomber up aloft is sending its stuff down a beam, a tight beam to the wobbly. Listen to it. The uncouth, crackling syllables of the enemy tongue came from the vision set. Someone was speaking crisply and precisely somewhere. Blurred, indistinct flashes appeared upon the vision set screen. They ought to be worried, said the copter man wearily. Even an infrared telescope can't pick up a damn thing through the clouds like this, and the wobbly's in a mess without a bomber to help. Sergeant Walpole did not reply. He was exhausted. He sat looking tiredly off through the rain in the direction of the approaching noise. Somehow, it did not occur to him to run away. He sat quite still, smoking a soggy cigarette. Something big and huge appeared behind a monstrous oak tree. It came on. The oak tree crackled, crashed, and went down. It was ground under by the monstrous war engine that went over it. The wobbly was unbelievably impersonal and horrible in its progress. There had been a filling station for driver cars close by the place where the artillery train had been wrecked. One of the 8-foot treads loomed over that station, descended upon it, and the filling station was no more. The wobbly was then not more than 100 yards from Sergeant Walpole, less than a city block. He looked at it in weary detachment. It was as high as a 4-story house, and it was 200 feet long and 40 feet wide at the treads, with the monstrous gun bulges reaching out an extra 10 or 15 feet on either side above, and it came grumbling on toward him. Part 6. Considered as a strategic move, the wobbly was a triumph. 18 hours after its landing, the orders for troops called for 500,000 men to be withdrawn from the forces at the front and in reserve, and munitions factories were being diverted from the supply of the front to the manufacture of devices designed to cope with it. This, in turn, entailed changes in the frontline activities of the command. Altogether, it may be said that the wobbly, 18 hours after its landing, was exerting the military pressure of an army of not less than 500,000 men upon the most vulnerable spot in our defenses, the rear. And when its effect upon the civilian morale is concerned, the wobbly, as of force and being, constituted the most formidable military unit in history. Strategic Lessons of the War, 1941 to 1943. U.S. War College, page 43. As Sergeant Walpole saw the wobbly, there was no sign of humanity anywhere about the thing. It was a monstrous mass of metal, powder-stained now where shells had burst upon it, and it seemed metallically alive, impersonally living. The armored tube with its vision slits at its ends must have been the counterpart of a ship's bridge, but it looked like an iridge of an insect's face. The bulbous control rooms at the ends looked like a gigantic insect's multifaceted eyes. And the huge treads, so thick as to constitute armor for its own protection, were so cunningly joined and sprung that they too seemed like part of a living thing. It came within 20 yards of the staff car with the copter man in it and Sergeant Walpole smoking outside. It ignored them. It had destroyed all life at this place. The Sergeant Walpole alone was visible. He sat motionless and detached, unemotionally waiting to be killed. The wobbly clanked and grumbled and roared oblivious past them. Sergeant Walpole saw the flexing springs in the tread joints, and there were hundreds of them, of a size to support a freight car. He saw a refuge tube casually ejecting a gush of malodorous stuff, in which the garbage of a mess table was plainly identifiable. A drop or two of the stuff splashed upon him, and he smelled coffee. And then the treads lifted, and he saw the monstrous gas-spreading tubes at the stern, and the exhaust pipes into which he could have ridden motorcycle and all. Then he saw a man in the wobbly. There were ventilation ports open at the pointed stern, and a man was looking out, some 15 feet above the ground, smoking placidly and looking out at the terrain the wobbly left behind it. He was wearing an enemy uniform cap. The monster went on. The roar of its passing diminished a little, and the copter man came suddenly out of the staff car, struggling with the portable vision set. "I think we can do it," he said shortly. "It's in constant beam communication with a bomber up aloft, and I think they're worried up there because they can't see a damn thing. But it's a good team. With the wobbly's beam, which takes so much power no bomber could possibly carry it, the bombers are safe, and the bombers can locate any motor-driven thing that might attack the wobbly and blow it to hell. But right now they can't see it. So I think we can do it. Coming?" Sergeant Walpole threw away his cigarette and rose stiffly. Even those few moments of rest had intensified his weariness. He flung a leg over the motorcycle's seat and pointed tiredly to the trail of the wobbly. It neared parallel here, a ribbon of concrete road which once had been a reasonably important feeder highway. "Let's go." They went off through the rain along the road, nearly parallel to the route the wobbly was taking. Rain beat at them. Off in the woods to their right, the wobbly noise grew louder as they overtook it. They passed it and came abruptly out of the wooded area upon cultivated fields, rolling and beautifully cared for. There had been a farm headquarters off to one side and a huge central station for all the agricultural work on which once could have been a half a country. But there were jagged walls where the buildings had been, and smoke still rose from the place. Then the wobbly came out of the woods, a dim, gray, monstrous shape in the rain. The helicopter man pulled at the ignition cord, and a rocket began to sputter. He made a single wipe with his knife blade along the twisted insulated wires of the missile battery, and a wavering blue spark leaped into being. The rocket shot upward, curved down, and landed with enough force to bury its head in a muddy, plowed earth and concealed the signal flare that must have been ignited. "That ought to do it," said the copter man. "Let's send some more." Sergeant Walpole got exhaustedly off his motorcycle and duplicated the copter man's efforts. A second rocket, a third, a dozen or more rockets went off, each one bearing a wavering, uncertain blue spark at its tip. And that spark would continue for a half an hour or more. In a loop aerial 8 miles up, it might sound like a spark plug, or it might sound like something else. But it would not sound like the sort of thing that ought to spring up suddenly in front of the wobbly, and it would sound like something that had better be bombed for safety's sake. The wobbly was moving across the plowed fields with deceptive smoothness. It was drawing nearer and nearer to the spot where the rockets had plunged to earth. It stopped. Another rocket left the weary pair of men, its nearly flashless exhaust invisible in the daytime anyway. The wobbly backed slowly from the irregular line where the first rocket sparked invisibly. It was no more than a distinct gray shadow in the falling rain, but the queer bulk atop of its body moved suddenly. Like a searchlight, the power beam swept the earth before the wobbly, but nothing happened. The copter man turned on the vision set he had packed from the staff gyro car. Voices, crisp and anxious, came out of it. He caressed the set affectionately. "Listen to them, Sergeant," he said hungrily. "They're worried." The voices changed suddenly. There was a dozen musical buzzing in the set, as of 24 splitting sparks in as many tones, all going at once. "Letting the guys on the wobbly hear what they hear," said the copter man grimly. "If God's good to us now..." The voices changed again. They stopped. The Wobbly itself was still, halted in its passage across a clear and rain-swept field by little sparking sounds which seemed to indicate the presence of something that had better be bombed for safety's sake. A thin whining noise came down from aloft. It rose to a piercing shriek, and there was a gigantic crater half a mile from the Wobbly, from which smoke rose lazily. The Wobbly remained motionless. Another whining noise, which turned into a shriek. The explosion was terrific. It was a bit nearer the Wobbly. "We'll send them some more rockets," the copter man said. They went hissing invisibly through the rain. The Wobbly backed cautiously away from the spot where they landed, because they were wholly invisible, and they made a sound which those in the Wobbly could not understand. As always, to a savage, the unexplained is dangerous. Modern warfare has reached the same high peaks of wisdom. The Wobbly drew off from the sparks because it could not know what made them, and because it had used its power beam and the bomber had dropped its bombs without stopping or destroying them. It was not inconceivable to anybody on either the Wobbly or the bombers aloft that inexplicable things could be especially contrived to confront the Wobblies, unless they were contrived to destroy it. "They don't know what in the hell they're up against," said the copter man joyously. "Now let's give them fits." The rockets went off in swift succession. To the blinded men in the bomber above the clouds, it seemed that unexplained mechanisms were springing into action by dozens, all about the Wobbly. They were mechanisms. They were electric mechanisms. They were obviously designed to have some effect on the Wobbly. And the Wobbly had no defense against the unguessed at effects of an unknown weapons except bombs began to rain from the sky. The Wobbly crawled toward the last gap left in the ring of mysterious mechanisms that closed. Triumphant, singing sparks sprang viciously in the amplifiers. Nothing was visible. Nothing. Perhaps that was the precipitated panic. The bombers rained down their deadly missiles, and somebody forgot the exact length of time it takes a bomb to drop 8 miles. Sergeant Walpole and the copter man were flat on the ground with their hands to their ears. The ground bucked and smote them. The unthinkable violence of hexanite explosions tore at their nerves, even at their sanity. And then there was an explosion with a subtle difference in its sound. Sergeant Walpole looked up at his head throbbing, his eyes watering, dizzy and dazed and bleeding at the nose and ears. Then he bumped into the copter man, shuddering on the ground. He did it deliberately. There was a last crashing sound, and some of the blasted earth spattered upon them. But then the copter man looked where Sergeant Walpole pointed dizzily. The Wobbly was careened crazily on one side. One of its tread was uncoiling slowly from its frame. Its stern was blown in. Someone had forgotten how long it takes a bomb to drop 8 miles, and the Wobbly had crawled under one. More from the racked open stern, the Wobbly, there was coming a roaring, spitting cloud of gas. The Wobbly's storage tanks of gas had been set off. Inside it would be a shambles. Its crew would be dead, killed by the gas the Wobbly itself had broadcast in its wake. Part 7. It is a point worth noting by any student of strategy that while the Wobbly, in working solely for the effectiveness in lowering civilian morale, worked upon sound principles, yet the destruction of the Wobbly by Sergeant Walpole and Flight Cadet Ryerson immediately repaired all the damage done. Had it worked towards a more direct military aims, its work would have survived it. It remains a pretty question for the student whether the enemy command, with the information it possessed, made the soundest strategic use of its unparalleled weapon. But on the whole, the raid of the Wobbly remains the most startling single strategic operations of the war, if only because of its tremendous effect upon civilian morale. Strategic Lessons of the War, 1941 to 1943. Yours War College, pages 94 to 96. A major general climbed out of a staff gyrocar and waded through the mud for half a mile, after which he, in person, waked two sleeping men. They were sprawled out in the puddle of the rain, which had gathered in a war-torn tread from the wobbly. They waked with extreme reluctance, and then yawned even in the act of saluting a military manner. "Yes, sir," said Sergeant Walpole, yawning again. "Yes, sir, the bomber's gone. We heard 'em trying to raise the wobbly for half an hour after she'd blown up. Then they cut off. I think they went home, sir. Most likely, sir, they think we used some new dinkus on the wobbly, and ain't likely they'll realize they blew it up themselves for us." The Major General gave crisp orders. Men began to explore the wobbly cautiously. He turned back to the two sleepy and disreputable men who had caused its destruction. His aspect was one of perplexity and admiration. "What did you men do?" he demanded warmly. "What in the hell did you do?" Sergeant Walpole grinned tiredly. The copter man spoke for him. "I think, sir," said the helicopter man, "that we affected the morale of the wobblies and the bombers' crews." Morale, a story of the war of 1941 to 1943 by Murray Leinster, recorded by Ralph J. Martin.